Okay.
Okay.
Hi, folks. I'm going to do an abbreviated introduction because I started 5 minutes late, and maybe that's a smart thing to do because I normally run my mouth for 10 minutes introducing, and instead I'm just going to run it for 5, and then we're going to get into the program. I'd like to welcome you to, I think, our 9th or 10th Zoom interview for the 2022 season. Our interviewee tonight is Dr. Tim Smith from the University of Tennessee at Martin. Tim has been beaten butt and taken names for the last 10 or so years and has become a major force in scholarship in the Western theater. If you haven't read one of his books, you ought to, and you have a wide range of choices in which to pick because Tim has written about everything, including how they set up memorials at the park at Shiloh. It's a wide-ranging level of scholarship, and he matches that on the battlefields with some superb and innovative programs. Our first 2 programs with him, the first one we did was Grierson's Raid last year, and that was intended. It was a first time ever. It was based on his book on Grierson's Raid, and consequently, it was going to be probably the first tour that ever actually was fairly close to the routes that had been recently documented that Grierson had taken. Unfortunately, the COVID got in people's ways. I see Don Johnson on the group tonight. Don was going to go with us, and his wife roped him in and said, "Oh no, you're not." And I didn't understand at the time, but I do understand it now because those of you who read our newsletter noticed that for the first time in 15 months, we had to deal with COVID on one of our tours, and we had 11 people last week, and 5 so far have turned up with COVID. So we have revised our COVID protocols, which you'll see on our website. The talk tonight. Tim's other program was he did a detailed walking tour of in the valleys and over the hills of Vicksburg, covering the first couple of assaults on the 19th and 23rd of May of '63, and he asked tonight if any of the other people who he had worn out on the Vicksburg program were coming back to Shiloh, and I was happy to report to him that several were. He was surprised because he thought he had walked him too hard. His third program is going to be the first one that we wanted to do with him that COVID got back in 2020, and that is Grant Moves South. And in a sequential means of looking at how Tim approaches things, he seems to be working and building his scholarship pretty solidly from the commencement of Grant's operations up north along the Kentucky-Tennessee border on the upper levels and in Missouri, and then working them all the way down to Vicksburg, which he has worked with us before. So Tim's field of expertise ranges all the way from the Ohio River and the Mississippi Junction all the way down to the area just to the south of Vicksburg. And I'm sure he's got a few other places beyond that. So it's going to be an exciting and fun conversation tonight. And with that, I see we're ready to start. And so I say, good evening, Tim. Good to see you.
Good evening. Good to be here.
Good. I'm not seeing you. There we go. Okay, we're back in business. Tim, I did a quick, as you heard, I did a real quick thumbnail of what I perceive to be the scholarship that has come out of those 1,000 books or more that are sitting over your shoulder and the products that you've had there. I want you to open up by telling us a little bit what came first, the chicken or the egg? Did you have an overarching interest in the Civil War as a whole, or was there some individual in the Civil War that fascinated you, that caused you to broaden out into the field?
Well, the chicken and the egg kind of came at the same time a little bit, if that's possible. Growing up in Mississippi, I grew up in a place called Carrollton, which was just about right in the middle of Vicksburg and Shiloh. We would go to both numerous times a year. In fact, we'd go to Shiloh for the umpteenth time in a year, and we'd been there so many times we'd say, I was 8 years old or so. Do you really want to walk down the sunken road this time? Well, we just walked down it last time, a month ago or something. And so we'd just ride around. But, there was just something, there was a draw, just the Shiloh mystique, if you will, that drew you, just wanted to go back. And Vicksburg's very, very similar as well. And in particular, dealing with ancestors, genealogy, and all of that. It's ironic that I had no ancestor at Shiloh, but I had 4 actually inside Vicksburg. 3 of them surrendered. One of them was killed, and then another one outside Vicksburg. So lots of family history and so on in the Vicksburg campaign, and so that, of course, opened me up to the Western theater, opened my eyes to the West, and growing up in Mississippi and so on. At the same time, I drank the Kool-Aid just like everybody else did when I started acquiring books and reading and so on. It was First Lee's Lieutenants and all the Eastern stuff. And so it was kind of a dual thing, the East and the fascination with Robert E. Lee and Jackson and Gettysburg and all that kind of stuff. But still at the same time, knowing, hey, there's stuff that happened out here in the West that's really important as well. And so when I got into graduate school and started digging deeper into this and so on, I kind of landed in the Western theater a little bit, and we could get into, y'all were arguing a while ago about politics, but we could get in a real argument over the East versus the West and the importance and all of that. But I've landed obviously in the West, and I try to stay in my lane a little bit and not dabble too much elsewhere, and found a home here in the Mississippi Valley.
Tim, let me ask you a favor. It may be I got too much wax in my ears or whatever, but might you sit a little close to your mic or maybe speak up just a wee bit?
Yeah.
I was a little bit strained to hear you, and I know there are older folks than me on this that may not have heard you too well either. I look over your shoulder and I see, looks like John Simon sold you about 7 copies of Grant's papers. That's what you have sitting on your shelf up there?
Right. Yeah.
When did
Grant,
you, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, when did you take a fancy to Grant, or did he just kind of jump out at you and say, hey, I better pay attention to this guy, he's important down here?
Yeah. I'm going to try to speak up a little bit. I'm sitting about a foot from my phone, actually, so I don't think I can get much closer there. But, dealing with the West the way I do, you can't miss Grant, of course. And it's kind of ironic that a Mississippi boy that had ancestors inside Vicksburg in the Confederate Army and all of that would turn out to be a little bit of a Grant fan. But that's basically what I've turned out to be. I like Grant. I think he was the dominant force in the Civil War, better than Lee, actually, obviously won. It's to the point now I'm not really a fanboy or anything like that. In fact, I kind of get a little bit of a kick out of bursting people's bubbles a little bit about Grant. They think I'm just, a Grant partisan and so on, but I like to call out Grant when necessary. And I think there are numerous occasions when it is necessary to call out Grant that, he did this or should have done this, and armchair general and so on like that. But there are numerous instances when he maybe didn't tell the truth in this, or, his memoirs doesn't match the letters that he's written in the Simon papers there and all that. So Shiloh and Vicksburg, there are numerous instances of that, and we'll see some of these at Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, and even Belmont. So yeah, I'm a Grant fan, and I, when I really started digging into the Western Theater, I discovered Grant, and it took me a little while to admit that I'm actually a fan of this guy, but I don't know how anybody can really look objectively at the Civil War and not come to that conclusion.
I've looked at Grant, and not too many years ago, maybe 5-10 years ago, Ed Bars and I sat down, and we were riding back from Wilmington, North Carolina, and as we were wont to do on some of these trips, we'd come up and we'd compare lists of things, who's best historians, blah 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 blah. In this particular ride, the topic was who were the 5 greatest generals in U.S. military history, and I think Bars, by and large, thought that George Washington probably stood first among all, and I told him I thought actually George Marshall stood above all others, and that I thought that Washington was second and Grant was third, but pretty rarefied air because, of course, whereas Washington created a nation, Grant saved a nation, Marshall saved a world with World War II, and then, of course, in his role as Secretary of State in the Marshall Plan. And so in looking at those, Grant runs high. And when Ed asked me what I thought was most important about Grant, I said he understood the calculus of war. And I think that the thing that stood out above everything else with Grant to me was the fact that he understood, like a bulldog. Bulldog is tough in a fight because once he gets hold of you, he won't let go. And Grant was the same way. If once Grant got his teeth into you, he wasn't going to let you go, no matter where you were. And I thought that was very impressive. But he had some downsides too. And I was wanting to know, from your perspective, he's got some problems with always accepting responsibility, and he scapegoats some people. The folks that come to mind to me are people like Lew Wallace and William Rosecrans, and even George Thomas. And I'm just wondering, in your living out there and living with him, what's your view of Grant as a leader and as a man who's able to accept responsibility for his actions?
Well, you could add John McClernand to that list.
And McClernand, sure.
I think you're absolutely right. I've often said Grant has a PR department on his staff that if you run foul of Grant or his PR department, they will throw you under the bus in a heartbeat. And it doesn't help if you're not a West Point trained officer. And so Grant, he can carry a grudge. And if you ever get on Grant's bad side, you probably are not going to get back on a good side. Now, that said, another fault of Grant, and I won't dwell on faults, but one of the faults is that Grant is just a horrible judge of character. Whether it's early in his staff, he gets later on in Virginia and so on, he gets a much more professional staff. But whether it's in choosing his initial staff out here in the West, or his cabinet secretaries in his administration, or some of his generals, he's a poor judge of character. And I think Grant's such a good-hearted somebody, wouldn't hurt anybody, physically and do any meanness to them. And I think he thinks all other humans are just like that. And so he's a little bit gullible. He's a little bit naive, even in his presidency a little bit. And so he's not a terribly good judge of character. everybody talks about is drinking and alcohol and all that. I don't see that as a huge problem. It never causes any major issues in his command or his president. I happen to think Grant's major problem, and we're going to see this numerous times as we go throughout his early combat in the West, at Belmont and Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, and Shiloh, and even in the early stages of the Vicksburg campaign. I think Grant's major problem early on was his overconfidence. He thinks that he's the one that's ruling what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and he never takes into considerations that the enemy could not go according to his plan. And so at Belmont, he's surprised by this counterattack. At Fort Donelson, he's surprised by the counterattack. At Shiloh, he's surprised by the Confederate attack. Even in the early stages of the Vicksburg campaign, he writes Julia numerous times that, I think I'll be in Vicksburg in a week, and this is like in late January or so.
Yeah.
So he has a little bit of an overconfidence problem, and that probably goes back to the bulldog mentality that you speak of. Bulldogs pretty confident folks there. Which ironically, that his presidential library and papers now are at Mississippi State. And John Marszalek declares that it was just a preordained thing that they come to Mississippi State because he shows a letter that Lincoln wrote to him, I believe, in the Overland campaign in Virginia, that said, "Hold on and chew and bite and hold like with a bulldog grip," he said. And so John says it's just foreordained that he would come to Mississippi State, who are the Bulldogs, of course. So all of that was supposed to happen like that. So, yeah, there are some faults for Grant. There are a lot of other positives. We can talk about those if you'd like as well. But I'm not afraid to call Grant out when I think he's done wrong or when he has made a misstep, but I think his positive actions far outweigh his missteps.
I think the other side, and I think you hit the nail on the head, is that I find Grant to be genuine, and there are a lot of people whose character and their experience and so forth prevents them from being authentic in what they do. But I think that in each instance, I think Grant looks at a problem. I think he generally looks it square in the eye, and he accepts the limitations, and yet he understands politically. I think he intuitively understands the essence of what Abraham Lincoln needs, even though he hasn't met Lincoln. I think he understands what the politician overlooking a war effort has to have. And so I find that so much of what he does is always moving forward, always trying to find a way to advance 3 yards. Even if he gets thrown back a yard, he still gains 3 yards, he gains 4 yards, and keeps moving forward. And of course, Mark Grimsley, in doing a series of essays on the Overland campaign, named it "And Keep Moving On," which was a play off of a quote that Grant was supposed to have made in the start of the Overland campaign, in which you just get at the enemy and hit him as hard as you can and keep moving on. But I see lots of trends in that, and I think that's what's really interesting about what you're about to undertake with this Grant Move South program, because people are going to get an opportunity to see Grant in the formulative period of his military education, because I don't really think that he has a real combat education until the American Civil War. I think everything, the Mexican, I think, is of no real consequence. He has experience, but I don't think it is hugely important in his development. But I do see a tremendous amount of stepping to the line at the start when he seeks a commission, finally takes the the 23rd Ohio. Is that his initial unit, or
Illinois?
The 23rd Illinois, and then he thinks he should get more rank, doesn't get it initially, but then quickly receives it. Now, in the first part of this program, of course, we're going to take and invest all this time to go up to Belmont and the Ohio River and so forth, which is pretty good size little haul from south of Memphis. What's the most important stuff you get out of Grant in that first period in which he's commanding and ends up engaging at Belmont and then going into Kentucky at Paducah? What do you get out of all that?
Well, this is where Grant obviously cuts his teeth in the military, and I agree fully about the Mexican War. Everybody talks about the Mexican War experience and all that. In fact, I wrote an article, and I assume we're going to have a first night talk at the hotel. Are we planning to do that? I haven't looked at the schedule recently. We normally do that, and I actually may do this as the talk, but I give a lecture about the military education of Ulysses S. Grant, and I basically argue that his time at West Point was pretty much his elementary education. That he was introduced to the concepts of reading, writing, and arithmetic, the 3 R's,
right.
In terms of the military. Then his post-West Point training, his service in the Army, the Mexican War, and all that is kind of his secondary education, high school, and where he kind of begins to delve deeper into it and so on. But then I go into each of his 4 years of the Civil War, and I compare that to his bachelor's degree, his 4 years of college. And if you look at Grant the freshman, and that's what we're looking a lot at, Grant, this trip, this is where
we just lost him for a second. Okay, hang in there. What,
right.
Karen, did we get him back?
Am I back?
I hear you again. Go ahead.
Okay.
You're talking about Grant the freshman.
Yeah, Grant the freshman. These freshmen show up at college and they're wide-eyed and they're going to take the place by storm, and they're a big fish in a little pond coming out of high school, but now they're a little fish in a big pond. But it takes them a little while to figure out, okay, I'm not the big dog anymore, and so on. And they kind of get a little bit of maybe a reality lesson. And I think that's what happens in Grant's first year. Even though he did very well, yes, he took the place by storm and so on. That I've got to do a little more to get by with this. And of course, you enter your sophomore year, and you always talk about a sophomore slump, whether it's in baseball or in college or whatever. And part of, Grant's most miserable time in the Civil War is that second year, from maybe February to 62 to February 63. So as we look at his sophomore year, he kind of goes into a slump with Shiloh and then almost leaves the Army, at Corinth, and in the first stages of the Vicksburg campaign. But then his third year, as you get into Vicksburg and then Chattanooga and so on, the junior year is when you start really working on your major and start really figuring out what you're doing and how to do this stuff and so on. And then, of course, the senior year is the capstone year, and that's in Virginia, that last year in Virginia where he really proves that he knows what he's doing and he graduates. And then I've even taken it a little bit farther and talked about, am I still there? This thing's beeping at it. Went out for some reason just a second ago. At any rate, I took it on to, you get a master's maybe in whatever your field is. And that's when he serves as the general of the Army post-war and even partially a time as Secretary of War. And then, of course, you get your terminal degree in any field, history or whatever, and that's the PhD. And, of course, the terminal degree for a military commander is the commander-in-chief position as President of the United States. So he got his terminal degree. So it's an interesting little way to look at Grant. But specifically for this tour, what we'll be looking at is his freshman year. And he does very well. You know, I've often said if there's a rookie of the year for the Union Army, the first year of the war, from, you know, the formation of the Confederacy, February 1861 to February 1862, it'd probably be Ulysses S. Grant. McClellan has done really nothing yet to prove it. And of course, he won't do anything to prove that he would be it. Sherman fades, others fade, but Grant comes to February 1862, and he'd probably be Rookie of the Year. But then he hits that sophomore slump. So we'll look at this freshman year and the first of his sophomore year in his military education, and he learns basically how to do things, how to go from high school to college at Belmont and Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, and how to operate with these big armies that just dwarf anything that was in the Mexican War.
You know, I think you hit an interesting point. I like the analogy, and it's also interesting. And I'm going to ask you to tie in. You know, McClellan's success in Western Virginia, in juxtaposed against McDowell's miserable failure and Scott's, I think Scott probably is a little too smart for the government in 1861. He's thinking with the Anaconda Plan and so forth, he's thinking really big stuff, whereas I think initially the government thinks that this can be an insurgency that's just put down. And so Scott becomes kind of ancient rapidly. He's 70 years old, and McDowell fails. And so the only person that succeeds in the first couple of months of the war is George McClellan, and he's within commuter distance to bring him over and put him in charge. Whereas in the West, what's interesting about this is that Grant is a division commander or subordinate to Henry Halleck. And, you know, before we get into I think our time is good. And so before we get into some of the stuff you're going to do, some of these battles, how about let's talk a little bit about Henry Halleck and his role in the war, in the early part of the war, and his influence positively and negatively on Grant and or Sherman, primarily on Grant.
Okay. Halleck obviously is a major player, but I think, you know, everybody talks about Halleck is jealous of Grant, especially after Fort Henry and Fort Donelson and all that. John Marszalek, I mentioned him just a minute ago. Of course, he wrote the biography of Sherman and Halleck, so
that's right.
A little bit about this stuff. But he says it really was not so much jealousy as it was just absolutely two different ways of working the system, working the military way of doing things, two different theories of war, if you will. And Grant and Halleck, I was getting tickled. I was turning in grades while you two were discussing solving today's political problems. But it was almost like you two were talking past each other. Both of you were telling your points, and neither one of you were listening to the other. And we see that on TV, obviously, and all that. But that's kind of like with Grant and Halleck. They were talking past each other, and neither one of them it wasn't resonating on what they were hearing. And so when Halleck would say something, it made no sense to Grant because it didn't make a whole lot of common sense. A lot of Grant's common sense didn't make a lot of points with Halleck because it wasn't done by the book. You know, there is a book that says how you do things. And Halleck is very, very Jominian in nature. And I'll get into a little bit of this on the tour. And I'm just fascinated. I'm going to write a book on Jomini and Clausewitz and the influence on the Civil War and commanders. I already started working on it a little bit. But Halleck and McClellan and Rosecrans and Sherman and Johnston, Joseph V, and all of these guys, the vast majority of Civil War commanders are very Jominian in nature, because that's what they learned at West Point. That's what they were taught. Even if they didn't read Jomini, Thayer and all of these, the professors there had read Jomini, and they would teach that. And that's, you got a steady diet of Jomini type of stuff. Grant starts out, and I've traced his kind of lineage in this a little bit. He starts out very Jominian in his operations, but there's a change in the Vicksburg campaign. In fact, when Grant starts his Mississippi Central and Chickasaw Bayou campaign, they're very Jominian in nature. And he actually says, I knew Halleck, and I knew I had to do things by the book, the way Halleck would want me to do it. But then very soon, Grant figured out this ain't working. And so I got to take that book and toss it, and I got to get rid of this book. And he starts doing very unconventional but more common sense type things, like turning Vicksburg through bayous and trying to divert the Mississippi River and breaking away from his supply line. And we could argue over that as well. These are very non-Jominian type of things. And then we see it on later in the war. He continues very much a more Clausewitzian view of fighting and politics, and, you know, as an extension of politics and politics by another means and all that. And whereas Jomini, you know, had told his readers that you go after geographic points, decisive points, and secure supply lines and all that, what did he tell Meade and Sherman in 1864? You go where their armies go. Forget the decisive points. You follow those armies, and the decisive points will fall. So Grant winds up very Clausewitzian in theory. But what intrigues me about this is that I can't prove it, but I would bet my life nearly that Grant never read Clausewitz.
I'm sure he didn't.
Nobody. It's not translated until 1873 into English. Got very little from the Mahans and the Thayers and so on at West Point from about Clausewitz, because they hadn't read Clausewitz either. And so there's very little Clausewitzian influence, but for some way, Grant comes up with this Clausewitzian mindset on his own, and it's very much common sense, you know. And I like to joke that Grant is much like Barbara Mandrell. When Barbara Mandrell was country when country wasn't cool, Grant was Clausewitzian when Clausewitz wasn't cool, and he had figured all this out pretty much on his own. And so there's only just a very few Civil War commanders that were actually Clausewitzian rather than Jominian. And these happen to be the ones you're talking about. Grant is genuine. That I get irritated at these phony generals, you know, that say one thing and do another thing, and then they write their memoirs and all that. And I may offend somebody, I don't know, but there's nobody any phonier than Joseph E. Johnston or George McClellan or some of those guys. You know, Beauregard could be put in that category. But then on the other hand, there are some figures that are just absolutely genuine. And I think Lee is one of those. Lincoln is one of those. To a certain degree, and I've just finished a manuscript on Albert Sidney Johnston, but Albert Sidney Johnston is becoming one of those, and Grant becomes one of those Clausewitzian. All of these are Clausewitzian, but they're also pretty genuine. Not to say Grant won't throw you under the bus and he can hold some grudges and so on, but by and large, Grant is more in the vein of a Lee or a Lincoln than otherwise. So on this tour, what we'll see is the development of Grant in a Jominian type of mindset, because his boss is telling him this is what you got to do. You know, who goes into a job and the boss has complete authority over you, and you tell the boss, you know, your way of doing things is stupid. I'm going to do it my way. That is not a way to win friends and influence people. You know, you got to do things the boss's way. And so for the first year and a half or so of the war, Grant does things Halleck's way. And Halleck is still not satisfied. But when Grant gets a little more autonomy and a little more freedom, he'll start to do it his way. And lo and behold, he fools around and wins the war.
You know, something I see, and you've attributed to Clausewitz, and I think that I almost have to separate from Clausewitz in the Civil War, because I really don't think, I think he becomes a person whom you can use as an adjective to describe what we see as success in the Civil War, which are the difference between people who have been traditionally trained in the Jominian way and who continually plod along without great success as leaders in the war, and then the people who ultimately make the war happen, who make things shift and happen and create opportunities, are people who aren't necessarily Clausewitzian. They just think outside the box. They've had their formal education, but it's those people that run. Like Lee, there's nobody more formally trained than Robert E. Lee, but Lee takes his experience in Mexico as an engineer and sitting and supporting Scott, and it gives him, I think, the sense of what is possible if you take the lead and become daring and look to hit where you're not expected to hit. And so I think Lee spends his whole war trying to take advantage of the limited manpower he has and tries to hit those key spots before the enemy gets too large or he gets too worn down and can't do anything with it. By the same token, I think what you see with Grant, even in his freshman year, is you see him complying with the headmaster's directives, and the headmaster is clearly Halleck, and Halleck is trying to sort out problems of command in the West, and Grant has to work within that, and a few times he gets sent to the corner. He gets sent to timeout because he doesn't do it the way the boss wants him to do it. Let's talk about one of those. Let's talk about Leonidas Polk goes into Kentucky and violates Kentucky neutrality. Grant is sitting on the Ohio River. Polk violates neutrality. What do you learn from Grant waiting to enter Paducah and go into Kentucky in that first engagement, of which Belmont is a feature of that first phase? But what do you learn of Grant along the banks of the Ohio?
Well, you learn that Grant has, I talked about him being a little bit gullible and a little bit naive, but on the other hand, he has an innate, again, common sense in terms of the larger context of the politics. And this is where I somewhat, I understand what you're saying about Clausewitz and all that. They didn't read Clausewitz. They didn't know they were Clausewitzian. But even Lee, for instance, with what's he doing at the 7 days? He is hitting McClellan at that culminating point that Clausewitz talks about. So he's been on the defensive, but now he goes over on the offensive when McClellan has reached that point of overextension, if you will. So a lot of the tenets of Grant, Lee, and so on are very Clausewitzian. They didn't know it. They didn't put it in those terms, but they know it. And part of course, the Clausewitzian idea is the politics behind every action. War is an extension of politics and all of that. And I think you see Grant and his grasp of the political aspects of this, and you see it later on in the Vicksburg campaign in obvious ways and so on. But Grant realizes this whole thing about Kentucky and neutrality and all of that. I think you see Grant starting to leap to a political as much as a military objective here. And of course, it doesn't hurt that Paducah and Smithland, both of which we're going to see at the mouths of the Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers, are very well endowed military points as well. So there's a political aspect of this, but there's also a military aspect. And I think a lot of times we kind of just blow Grant off as a political buffoon a little bit. Although his presidency is starting to be really rehabilitated and so on. But I think it's anything but that. I think whether it's military or political, he has just kind of a inherent common sense that we talk about with a lot of, they talk about Nathan Bedford Forrest and so on, just had the common sense type of thing. And Grant very much has that, stumbles in implementing it here and there. But he has that kind of almost sixth sense there in terms of the politics involved. And that's part of this action going into Paducah and taking the mouths of those rivers.
We talk about military intuition, and shortly after he enters Kentucky, and then he stages from the area he's got in the crosshairs down the Cumberland River. He's got Fort Donelson, and down the Tennessee River he's got Fort Henry, and he goes and gets them both. What's your 5-minute synopsis of what we learn about Grant at Henry and Donelson?
Well, we learned that Grant is still overconfident, even this, a year into the war, because he thinks they're not going to do anything to me that I don't start. He actually admits it, that he's away from the Army when the Confederates counterattack at Fort Donelson on February the 15th. But I think we see Grant again as kind of the larger contextual master. And to go back to Jomini and Clausewitz, and I'm not sure exactly how to say it. If anybody knows French, they can tell me better. But both Jomini and Clausewitz talks about the coup de, or it looks like coup d'oil. How do you say it?
Coup d'oil.
Okay.
It's that inspiration that
I'm anything but French, but being able to pick up immediately, not only the just in a glance, the terrain, but also the strategic implications, the political implications, and all that. And Grant realizes very quickly that Halleck is moving slow. Really doesn't want me to take any chances, do anything, but we have a golden opportunity here to move up either the Tennessee or the Cumberland River. Grant actually wants to move up the Cumberland first, but Flag Officer Foote talks him into going up to Tennessee. And it's a good thing because really, and I'll point this out as we go, and we'll go down to this railroad bridge at Danville, the key to all of this is not necessarily Fort Donelson, not even Nashville, not Fort Henry, but it is that railroad bridge on the Memphis and Ohio Railroad at Danville, just south of Fort Henry, that is the key to the whole operation. Because if that bridge is broken, then the two wings of the Confederate Army are separated on each bank of the Tennessee River. And Grant sees this immediately and takes Fort Henry, which allows the Federals to push on southward on the Tennessee. And very quickly, Flag Officer Foote sends those timberclads down, and they take the bridge, and it literally divides the Confederate Western defense in two. And that's why you get the falling back from Bowling Green as well as Columbus, and that is really the key stroke in this whole thing. It forces everything down to the next tier of logistical railroads, and that's the Memphis and Charleston in North Alabama and North Mississippi. And so Grant realizes this immediately. He sees what is at stake, and he actually orders Halleck to send the boats down. Remember, the Navy is under Army control at this point, and so Grant will have Halleck send, or have Foote send the timberclads down south to take immediate control of that railroad bridge. And then Grant, he gets a little off track, and I don't want to say Fort Donelson's not important, not what I'm saying, but he decides, okay, we're going to go over and take Fort Donelson as well as a supporting position, obviously, when the real strategic movement is on down the Tennessee River. And so there's a little sidelight at Fort Donelson. Ironically, that's where he becomes a hero. Unconditional surrender. Grant captures a Confederate army, all of that. But then very quickly operations returned to the Tennessee River, and that's where the big blows are landed there on the Tennessee rather than the.
Are you submitting that if Grant goes past Henry and goes down with foot and goes down to northern Mississippi, are you submitting that Donelson doesn't even happen? It's just evacuated without defense?
It could very well, of course, we don't know, but it could very well have happened that way because Johnston is falling back anyway, Albert Sidney Johnston from Bowling Green, and his major fear is being cut off at the Cumberland River at Nashville. And the only thing defending the crossing at the Cumberland River in Nashville is Fort Donelson. So once the Confederate Army from Bowling Green falls back behind the Cumberland River, there's no need to hold Fort Donelson anymore. So Fort Donelson could have not even happened. But when you see this overconfidence as well, Grant writes Halleck and just scares the wits out of Halleck, of course, right after Fort Henry, and says, "Yeah, I think I'm gonna wander over to Fort Donelson and take it too."
Yeah.
A couple of days from now. Well, it doesn't turn out quite as easy as he thought it would in the next couple of days. So he's a little bit overconfident there. But the real strategic avenue of movement is not necessarily it's down the Tennessee into the heartland of the Confederacy. I did a map in the Fort Henry, Fort Donelson book that I shaded the area. The footprint of impact for Fort Henry is all the way up to Bowling Green, Kentucky, Columbus, Kentucky, southward to New Orleans, southward to Pensacola, and Mobile.
Break for control. You're breaking up a little.
Fall of Fort Henry sparks the concentration that ultimately will result in now. A little bit.
Okay, give me.
Okay, all right. It's the footprint of impact for Fort Henry is wide, very wide, because it's the fall of Fort Henry that causes the concentration that will result in Shiloh. The footprint of impact for Fort Donelson is much more minute, and it runs basically just along the Cumberland River from Fort Donelson to Nashville. And those are big impacts, obviously. But really, it's Fort Henry, before Fort Donelson even falls, that causes both wings of the Confederate Army to fall back, causes the reinforcement of the Kentucky line, ultimately at Corinth, and the concentration that ultimately results before Shiloh. All of that is Fort Henry rather than Fort Donelson.
That's an interesting point, Tim, and one that I honestly can't say that I ever considered before. And I see. I don't want to get too far ahead of my skis on this, but I have to pursue it for just a second, and then moving down to northern Mississippi. What you're submitting is that when Grant only needed one or the other, and Henry provided the greatest penetration capability. If Grant takes Henry, which was not a difficult thing to do because of the poor engineering of the fort,
right,
then he's out of the area relatively quickly, and like a hurricane, he can move probably more rapidly to northern Mississippi and northern Alabama then the Confederates can respond because he's on the move and he's got the initiative. What you're submitting is that Henry is going to cause Sidney Johnson to evacuate the Kentucky line. He just realized he can't have these guys interdicting his line, so he's got to fall further back to a point in which he can consolidate again and bring other troops in, which will be at Corinth. And so, in effect, what happens is Grant dribbles off over to Donelson. He also then draws Don Carlos Buell closer to the dividing lines of authority. And, of course, Buell ends up taking Nashville right after Grant takes Donelson and is basically told, you don't go there, because Halleck is not wanting that to happen. All that time invested is then time lost that allows Johnston to reconstitute another line farther down that Grant will now have to go down and address. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yes, bear in mind that once the federal timberclads get loose on the Tennessee, the Confederate defense is an eggshell. Once they break through that, the thin outer crust, there's nothing inside but gooey egg. And so those timberclads go all the way down on like February 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, all the way to Florence, Alabama, to the shoals at Muscle Shoals. And so there are Federals, and there's nothing to stop transports laden with troops from doing that either. There are Federals far south of Johnston's position at Bowling Green or even Nashville in his rear, splitting the two sides though there. So it is a very delicate situation for the Confederates. And had the Federals followed up at that point, who knows what would have happened, but that was not the way you did things then. By the book, you consolidate, you establish your secure supply lines, you bring in the supporting columns, Buell and so on, and you do it the Jominian way, and then you ratchet up for another leapfrog forward, which is ultimately what they did to Corinth and Shiloh.
And that's, of course, what gets Grant in trouble with Halleck, because Halleck believes that Henry is enough. It's time to consolidate there, maybe bring folks together and so forth. Grant is off now at Donelson, and even Nashville falls. And so, of course, Grant gets put on the shelf when Halleck starts to talk behind his back, suspecting that he's been drinking again, or at least passes that rumor forward. And so by the time Grant arrives in the vicinity of Pittsburgh Landing, he's number 2 to C.F. Smith. And he's believing that he's pretty well finished at this point. And it takes a little bit to get him reinforced. So what about Shiloh? How does he recover? And what is your thumbnail opinion about Grant at Shiloh?
Well, Grant will basically be reinstated because President Lincoln gets involved and tells Halleck basically, show me some evidence or shut up, put up or shut up. And Halleck all of a sudden becomes Grant's best friend. You can't resign because I intend for you to go take command of the army, kind of thing. Two-faced. You talk about a phony. Henry Halleck.
You betcha.
He's a phony rascal. At any rate, Grant shows up back and takes command from C.F. Smith. C.F. Smith had commanded the expedition forward. Grant still retained command of the district. But C.F. Smith was commander of the expedition on the ground forward. Grant shows up and retakes the command. And then again, we see this overconfidence that we've talked about over and over and over. Grant just cannot fathom that the Confederates would come out of their fortifications at Corinth and come attack me on open ground. We don't even need to entrench. There's no possible chance they're going to do this. So I'm going to train my army, drill my army, rather than entrench, which Halleck has told me to do. And so that gets him in trouble later on. It bites him in the rear end. But when ultimately the Confederates attack, again, Grant is not expecting it. And, Grant will go to his grave saying, we were not surprised at Shiloh.
He's a lying pony soldier.
Absolutely, Grant. But in a strategic or operational level, the Army of the Tennessee, no one in the Army of the Tennessee woke up the morning of April the 6th thinking we're going to fight the biggest battle in American history today. That nobody thought that. Obviously, they did, and so Grant has to kind of put that behind him and win the battle. Now, you gotta adapt. And that's another theme of Grant: adapt. And so he will adapt and he will fight the battle. He largely leaves the fighting to his division commanders. He's not in tactical control by any means. except to give large, overarching details and encouragement, like hold this line because we got reinforcements coming. Fall back gradually if you have to. We got to eat up daylight. And basically what Grant is doing is he's trading space for time. He's eating up daylight, trying to reach nightfall, because he knows if he reaches nightfall, he's got reinforcements coming in, not only portions of Buell's army, but also Lew Wallace, who's marching around out there doing something. He's not lost. That's a myth of Shiloh. But he knows if he can reach nightfall, he's got the battle probably won. And so he's trading space for time, gradually falling back at Shiloh until nightfall, and he wins there. Now, the critical decision is made actually not a military decision at Shiloh, but more so of a larger operational or even strategic, probably not strategic, operational level decision, and that is to stay and fight the second day. Numerous commanders, McPherson, Buell, Sherman, had all been thinking, let's get out of here. Let's put the river between us and them. We're whipped. But of course, Grant, had the devil's own day, yeah, I'll lick them tomorrow, the famous quote and so on. I've often thought, if George McClellan had been in command of the Union Army at Shiloh, what would have happened? He no doubt to me, he would have retreated. If George Hooker, or not George Hooker, Joseph Hooker had been in command of the Union Army at Shiloh, judging on what we see at Chancellorsville, probably would have retreated. But Grant chose to stay and to fight. And then the next major decision is the order to go on the offensive the morning of April the 7th, because not every general would have done this either. You think about Buell at Perryville. He's content just to let them wander away. You look at Rosecrans at both Corinth, which we're going to see in this tour in October, but more specifically at Stones River. Had Rosecrans counterattacked on January the 1st from that strong line of artillery at Stones River, I think we would look at Stones River very different today than we do as basically a stalemate. Grant does that. He orders the counterattack. Now, it helps that you get a bunch of reinforcements in, obviously, but Grant orders the counterattack, and so wins the major victory that is Shiloh. So Grant's fighting of the Battle of Shiloh is not necessarily tactical moving units here and so on. It's more of an overarching command of the situation, but letting his guys kind of fight it out. And we joke about sometimes that of his 6 division commanders, 5 of them were lawyers. So he puts basically his future in the hands of a bunch of lawyers at Shiloh, and somehow winds up winning the battle.
And he's still in command at the end of the day,
yeah,
exactly. But he might not have been. Now it's interesting because, of course, Shiloh comes to pass, and Halleck decides it's time for him to come to the field. And of course, we go through this ponderous formal siege of Corinth, similar to the siege McClellan is undergoing at about the same time in Yorktown, in the vicinity of Yorktown on the peninsula. And you see a diminishing way of war. You see a relatively aggressive officer in Grant being put on the shelf as the deputy commander of the forces at Corinth or besieging Corinth. And then suddenly Halleck is elevated to Washington, and Grant has the weights taken off his shoulder, and he becomes commander. Of course, I think the most illustrative battle involved in Grant's initial command is Iuka, and what does and doesn't happen at Iuka, what he does and doesn't do in cooperation with Rosecrans, and then subsequently he goes on leave. But the controversy at Iuka with the acoustic shadow and so forth, do you buy that? Do you buy an acoustic shadow?
Yeah, there are letters and diaries from Grant's command up there, MacArthur and so on, that say, we never heard about it. We never heard anything. So there are accounts of it. I think Grant, probably closer to the truth, just convinced himself that there's no way Rosecrans is going to reach Iuka in time to fight this afternoon. So we're just, again, a little bit of that I've already decided. So things aren't going to go the way unless I will them to, and lo and behold, Rosecrans does arrive late in the afternoon and launches the attack. Now, whether Grant hears it or not, again, there's evidence that you don't hear it. But there's a whole lot of skirmishing going on everywhere. And so you could have heard something, but maybe not to the degree of a full-fledged battle or something. So what part the acoustics play in this, I don't know. I think Grant had already decided, much like he had at Belmont and Fort Donelson and Shiloh, that this is the way it's going to happen and nothing's going to happen today. And it rises up and bites him again and gets him into trouble and causes that split between Rosecrans and Grant.
And I think also Grant again finds another scapegoat, which he'll get not once but twice. That's Robert Murphy. Poor Murphy, sitting in command at Iuka at the depot down there, gets shellacked there, and Grant ain't happy with him. And then who's the unlucky SOB that's sitting in Holly Springs when Van Dorn shows up at 10 o'clock at night? It's Robert Murphy again. So and then of course we have Grant misses the Battle of Corinth. He's visiting with Julia on a little bit of R&R. And then once Rosecrans tentatively goes after Van Dorn at Davis Bridge, Grant has now come down to Corinth and basically calls off Rosecrans and says, stop the pursuit, and Van Dorn escapes back to Holly Springs. I think the whole thing of what we're going to approach, and I see some people on here who have registered for your program. I think they're in for a huge treat because I've never seen anybody, we haven't done this before, take Grant through a freshman year of college and show how each class he takes gives him an individual grade for each class and gives him a GPA at the end of October of 62. But and of course, the sophomore year is going to start very quickly after that because of Holly Springs and Chickasaw Bayou and Sherman and picking off McClernand and so forth, but a really action-filled year and a half of experiences for Grant, and I think really a first-rate and orderly assembly and examination of what is going to prove to be a very successful Western strategy. I mean, this really is the foundational work of what's going to be victory in the West. And it is, right. You can't define it any other way. Grant does not lose the West. He progressively moves through and he wins every element of where he's at in the West to the point where he's finally elevated to the command of everything by the start of 64. And so I think if you were picking a critical path to victory in the Civil War, this certainly is it. So with that, I think I've got just a few minutes before 9. If you have that as well, if anybody wants to pop a question in real quick, we'll take maybe 3, 4, 5 minutes of questions, and then we'll call it a night. And those of you who haven't looked at this program yet, I highly encourage you to do so. It's online, and we've got a good registration already. So anybody, you can, let's see, you can unmute yourselves if you want to ask a question. Raise your hand if you can. If you see unmute, and then raise a hand, I'll call on you, and we'll go from there. And if you're just so dazzled by everything we have said and don't know what to say, okay, I see Stephen has given me this portrait picture of him again. Okay,
how about
Stephen,
it? How about it?
Question.
Yeah. Tim, this is going to be a great tour. I'm looking forward to it. You've written a lot of books. If I had to pick one to read before I come down there, do you have one out of the many you've written that I should read?
Maybe. Well, this whole thing, there's a trilogy from the University Press of Kansas, starting Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, then Shiloh, then Corinth, 1862. Right. So I'd recommend reading all three. But if you just had to read one of those, probably the Grand Invades Tennessee, because it deals with a lot of the larger structural and operational level of this. And Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, very complicated and so on. Shiloh will deal more mainly with specifically the battle.
Yeah.
But now Corinth will deal with both the siege and the battle and the occupation, the Union occupation in the middle. But probably for what we were talking about and so on, and a lot of what we're going to see on this tour, probably the Grand Invades Tennessee book.
Okay, that's
about
what I'll
Fort Henry
read.
and Fort Donelson. So.
Thanks.
Okay.
Sure. Who else out there? Surely somebody is sitting on a question that they just can't wait to ask. Maybe they aren't. Going. Okay, I'm not going to push it. You know, that's the old expression is don't push your luck. Somebody may ask you the question, when did you stop beating your wife? No, I don't want to do that. So we won't answer that question. Hey, Tim, I appreciate very much you taking the time to chat with us tonight. And I'm looking forward to it because I always exchange with my historians, and we've never had an opportunity to face to face. So I look forward to coming down. I promise just to ask questions when I think it's something we want to talk about. So I'm looking forward to having the opportunity to work with you and learn from you a great deal.
Looking forward to it.
Well, good enough. Karen, thank you very much for your assistance, dear. And folks, we look forward to seeing you if you can join us. So thanks a lot, and tell folks what you heard. We'll see you later on. Good night, Tim.
Good night.
Night. Night, Karen.
Good night, honey.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.